You are all most welcome to this combined course and seminar where we have the honor of having Dr. Paul Newton here. And he will very soon introduce himself because he has so many affiliations that I cannot even pronounce them all, I think. Here in Stockholm, we have also, besides the course, we have a number of participants. Right now, Professor Anders Björkman, malaria researcher, entered the room, and we have people from clinical pharmacology from the pediatric department and from other departments. And we also have a professor in pediatrics visiting us from Ujjain, India. And yeah, there are also a person from REACT in Uppsala here, Dusan, who recently joined REACT. We have people in the course also, as you that are in the course know, but we have people from various departments here at the Karolinska Institutet, from the more laboratory departments, from public health departments, from Lyme department, learning information, and so on. We also have from the Public Health Agency of Sweden. So now I will give the word to Paul Newton, and please give a brief introduction to yourself and then to the topic, and just some housekeeping information, as this is a course that is conducted in many different places. We have 2 sites in India, 2 people in China in different places, and 1 person in Malawi. And we will record this lecture so that we can upload it on the course page in Ping Pong. So my suggestion is that Paul make his presentation, and if there are any short questions, clarifications, that can be done during the presentation, but otherwise we take the main part of the discussion after the formal presentation. So, welcome.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. My name is Paul Newton. I work in Laos, in Southeast Asia. We have a small clinical infectious disease research unit there, funded by the Wellcome Trust. And I also work for WARN, the Worldwide Antimicrobial Resistance Network, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And one of our interests is medicine quality, so I've been asked to give a talk on that. And please do interrupt, or if anything isn't clear, let me know. So I exaggerate slightly on the first slide. There's clearly been some action, but I think the talk has dominating, considering the size of the problem. There's been remarkably little action. And I think our ancestors would have been very puzzled by our current lack of political will and interest in the subject. The picture at the top right are Arabian doctors in the 11th century beating a pharmacist who apparently sold them poor quality herbal medicines. The middle one is a letter to the Lancet in 1829 about fake quinine, and there were more letters in the Lancet in the Victorian era in the UK than there are now about medicine quality. And the US government accused formally the UK of deliberately exporting fake quinine to the US to sabotage the US war with Mexico. So it was a big hot potato at that time. On the left, this is from a book which describes the trade in fake cinchona bark, the origin of quinine, and this bark was the first effective antimalarial, and there was so much dismay with the quality of the barks that people were being sold around the world, mostly in Europe at that stage in the 1600s, that people stopped buying it because they just didn't believe it was the right thing. Bottom left is the public manufacture of medicines in Italy in the 1700s. People lost faith in pharmacists to such an extent that the only way that pharmacists could sort of show they were doing the right thing was by the public spectacle of the manufacturing of medicines. You might be surprised why there's an Egyptian mummy on the slide as well. Maybe you, in Sweden, you didn't do this, but in Britain in the 1900s, wealthy Brits used to eat Egyptian mummies, bits of, as a way of trying to prolong their lives. It was like a doctrine of signatures. The mummies were very old and well preserved, so they thought that they would live longer. And so enterprising people in London mummified cats and dogs and sold them as fake human mummy, which was incredibly expensive to British people so they live longer. But I imagine you didn't do this here in Sweden. So the sort of message is that this is an old problem. There was an Egyptian queen in 1500 BC who led an army expedition to what's now Ethiopia to try and source good quality medicines because she was so dismayed. So it has a very long history. But many of us are involved with all the things on the left, which millions and billions of euros and person hours of work are spent on, with the aim of trying to determine optimum therapy or optimum vaccine for a certain disease, and then working with national governments to try and see whether this is appropriate national policy. But there's really very little point in doing all of that if there's poor prescribing, poor adherence, and poor quality of the interventions. So it seems a hidden crevasse between all this investment on the left and the sort of the final common pathway to the benefit of the patients is effectively ruined by these three problems. So that you may have heard that there's been enormous political controversy over the definitions of poor quality medicines. And this has been very disabling. It's one of the reasons why there's been very little action, because people can't agree on what they're talking about. There's no common language around the world. In our group, we tend to use the definitions recently used by WHO, which divides poor quality medicines into two main groups: the falsified, which are made deliberately with intent to deceive health workers and patients, and therefore by definition is a criminal activity. We tend now to use the term falsified or spurious or fraudulent rather than the word counterfeit, because the word counterfeit has become mired in intellectual property discussions and disputes since the TRIPS agreement in '92. So there's been a sea change away from using the word counterfeit in public health to use the term falsified, so that avoids the problems of intellectual property rights. Whereas substandard medicines are those that are made in a genuine registered pharmaceutical factory, but there's a mistake in the production process, in the quality control, and I'll show you some examples of that. So that isn't done by intent, it's done by error and negligence. I don't know in Sweden where you have charges of corporate manslaughter or not, but that's one thing. Is if you had a company who made a really awful mistake through gross negligence in some parts of the world, then it could be a criminal offence of corporate manslaughter. But I don't think that's ever been invoked for medicine equality yet. So this is a Venn diagram that tries to illustrate that. And this is how we've been thinking of it, but by not all people would agree. So if you have all poor quality medicines as the whole circle, so all good quality medicines outside of that, then substandard medicines from factory error, falsified, intentional, fraudulent production for financial gain through fraud. There's a third category of degraded, which some people put in the substandard group. Degraded medicines are those that leave the factory, and if they were kept according to the guidelines on the packaging of storage and expiry date, then they should be fine. But if they're exposed, as so often in hot climates, to temperatures that exceed that, then they degrade. For example, that they may have a reduction in the the amount of active ingredient within the medicine, or for some drugs like tetracycline, it might lead to toxic metabolites within toxic degradation products within the medicines. I think it's important to keep substandard and degraded separate because the origins are different and the solutions are different. And you really can't blame a pharmaceutical company if you store your medicines outside of their recommended ranges, not according to good pharmacy practice, and the solutions are not in the factory, they're in the pharmaceutical distribution chains, but others think they should be lumped together. But there's still no global consensus on this. There's now, after some years of debate, the WHO have had to set up a member state mechanism where all member states have a stake in trying to resolve these problems. And that's been going on for 4 years now. And it has been an extremely slow process. They took 6 months to agree on a chair for this member state mechanism. When for something like MERS, the new SARS, it just takes a few minutes for the world to come together, but it takes 6 months to come together over this. So there have been recent reports of poor quality antimalarials, of virtually all of them, both falsified and substandard. Thankfully, so far, there are no reports of poor quality intravenous or intramuscular artesunate, which is very important because that's, as you'll know, is the new globally recommended treatment for severe malaria. But on the other hand, virtually nobody has looked. So we can't put hand on heart and say that the quality of this vital, life-saving antimalarial is good quality because people aren't looking. So 2 or 3 years ago, we founded the WARN scientific group. Do all of you know about WARN? Anders knows about WARN. So WARN is the Worldwide Antimalarial Resistance Network, and it's a system for, in one place, giving all the information you may like from the publicly accessible literature on molecular markers of drug resistance for malaria in vitro assays and clinical trials, etc. If you type in WARN on the web, you'll find it, and that's funded by Gates. So, because of the problems of antimalarial quality, we've started a scientific group with the objectives as there, really to have one place where all the public accessible information could be tabulated and mapped. Because before then, it was all in a whole hodgepodge of places. It was really hard to find. So we put it all together and then mapped it. And to use this to try to advocate for more interest in the subject, and that there should be more attention paid not just to access to essential medicines, but access to good quality essential medicines. And so that's what it looks like. If you type in antimalarial quality survey, you find it. And it's just with support from the French government. We've also made it into French, so it's now in English and French. And each point represents one data set from each country, and you can filter it on the left by type of medicine, by the type of survey that was done, etc., etc. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of red in Africa. It's not on the map, but there's quite a lot of red in Southeast Asia as well. I think it's important to bear in mind that this is, I think, scientists and the peer review literature tend to more report bad news than good news. So this map is probably has more green, i.e. good quality evidence than we're aware of, just because people don't tend to write papers if they find a happy result, sadly. Certainly we find if we try and publish good news, we have much harder, greater difficulty in publishing it than if we publish bad news, which is a shame. So I think we should bear that in mind. And there are many problems with this data set, but it's a first attempt to try to see how we can do better. And as you can see, there are enormous areas of malarious Africa and South America, which there's no publicly accessible information on the quality of the anti-malarial supply, including with enormous populations at risk of malaria in, say, the DRC, Central African Republic, Cameroon, Angola, with virtually no information. There'll be more information held, we hope, by the medicine regulatory authorities and the national malaria control programs, but that's very, very hard to able to get access to. So our interest in this started in '98 when we had reports of falsified artesunate monotherapy in Southeast Asia, first in Cambodia. And these are some of the examples. One of these was seized by the Chinese police, and one is a genuine from the factory. And be interested to know whether so one is fake, one is genuine, would you take the one on the left or the one on the right? You might be confused with fever. You might be a rice farmer in Laos or a maize farmer in Central Africa, and your life will depend on which one of these you took. There's one clue. It's very clear when you know. Anyone like to guess? It's that. There's a dot at the end of 12 tabs in the genuine, and it's not there. And of course, all patients would know to look for that dot. And here are some examples of, these are sort of real genuines or real fakes. And if you wanted to have a look around and imagine that you are alone with malaria somewhere and you can't read any of the languages on the packet, which one would you take? And at the end, I can, if you wanted to, on the back there's a code. If you choose which code you would like to take, and then I can show you a slide at the end that tells you whether you survive or you need to go to intensive care here at Karolinska Hospital.
I'm happy to say that I selected the correct one.
Shh. So this was produced, this fake artesunate, which was obviously artesunate monotherapy that's no longer what's recommended since 2005. WHO have appealed for its use to be not to be a recommended drug for the treatment of uncomplicated malaria, so that it can be replaced by artemisinin-based combination therapy with a co-drug, so that both drugs can protect each other. But until then, it was, well, even now, sadly, it was very commonly available in Southeast Asia and Africa, and it was one of the main antimalarials that people were taking. And this company in China, which was the first major producer of artesunate monotherapy, Guilin Pharma, was targeted by criminals in China to a very large extent, and a lot of the supply, a third to a half in mainland Southeast Asia, was falsified, containing no active ingredient. In response to this, the Chinese company, I think they were the first Chinese company to put a protective hologram on the packet, which is about 1 centimeter across. But very quickly there was like a cold war between the genuine company and the criminals, where there were in the end at least 16 different types of fake hologram as they made them more sophisticated. And one thing that I've never understood is that in all those 16 types, they never managed to get the outer circle. You see the blocks in the outer circle? They never managed to get them in alignment. But they made silly mistakes like spelling the word tablet wrongly. And there were some from Burma where the expiry date was before the manufacturing date. That gave one cause for concern. And it was an enormous they were available in enormous amounts. One NGO, who should remain nameless, bought 100,000 tablets in one shop, and they were all fake. This is another example of one of the holograms of type 10 hologram, and you can see there's an X52 on the bottom, and that if you look at it with a banknote detector with a UV light, you can see this. And the company told us about this, but everybody kept it very secret. But in the end, the criminals found out, and they started putting an X52 dye mark on their holograms, but a different place on the mountains, presumably so that they could tell which was theirs easily and which was the genuine one. But now fake artesunate from Guilin has gone, because the genuine has also gone. Guilin, in response to the global appeal to stop making this medicine that was good, but we now know that there's ACTs are better, they've stopped making it, so therefore there's nothing for the criminals to copy. But at the time it was...
What is fakes? Is it zero artesunate or some artesunate?
Mostly zero. There were some examples from the Thai-Burma border containing small amounts of artesunate, just like 5 milligrams. That's when a normal tablet is 50 milligrams, which could be very dangerous for drug resistance, obviously. And there are also some from Laos where there were small amounts of the parent compound, artemisinin, in there as well. That in theory, small quantities of that would also engender artemisinin resistance. But mostly they contained no antimalarial, although many of them contained wrong active ingredients. There were some containing paracetamol, chloramphenicol. Some contained the raw ingredient for making ecstasy, suggesting, which is a banned chemical. It suggested that there was, it didn't have any of the good effects of ecstasy, but it suggested a link between manufacturers of narcotics and of fake medicines. So in response to this, a group of scientists and WHO and Interpol got together to try and obtain evidence as to where these might have been coming from, because there was virtually nothing happening back in 2005 about this, despite the obvious public health impact that you would expect it to have. And so we looked in the medicines, and we found lots of pollen. I hadn't realized it before then that in Australia and New Zealand they have a tradition of, because of the focal diversity of flora in Australasia, they use pollen to try and work out where somebody may have been, like solving murders by somebody saying that he hadn't been to this part of New Zealand, when the pollen in the mud on his or her shoes shows that that person must have been there. So a New Zealand palynologist adapted those techniques and found a whole diversity of pollen in the tablets that all suggested a source in southern China, along the southern China, Burma, Laos, Vietnam border. And we also found this beast in the tablet, quite a big mite. And we were very excited when they found this, because we thought this might give a clue as to where the medicines might be coming from. But sadly, it's the common house dust mite. It's a global and would be here in the carpet here in Karolinska, so it didn't help. But at that time, if you looked at the distribution of the different types, the forensic chemistry and pollen, and the packaging of them, there were two different trade routes, as you can see there. But still nothing was happening. So the evidence that I've just mentioned was taken by the Secretary General of Interpol to the Ministry of Public Security. He took it personally to Beijing and say, here, there's a big problem. And the Chinese police acted very quickly, and within a few days had arrested 3 people on the China-Burma border, and then the Myanmar police arrested more people in northern Burma. And that, at that time, cut the Western supply chain going through into Laos, the Thai-Cambodia border, and Myanmar. The Thai-Burma border and Myanmar, but it didn't cut the presumed route going through Vietnam into Cambodia. And those arrested had said they traded in enormous amounts of this stuff, nearly 250,000 blister packs, when one blister is one adult treatment course. And they had 24,000 packets on them when they were arrested. But now the problem that afflicted the Guilin company has largely gone in Southeast Asia, not because of any of this really, and not because the key thing has been the WHO appeal and countries' commitment to try to reduce the use of artesunate monotherapy at the same time as provision of global fund supported quality assured artemisinin-based combination therapy. And this reason was not the reason why countries and the global fund supply ACTs, but it was, I think, a very important good side effect of these programs. But elsewhere, as I'll explain shortly, things with ACTs have gone very wrong. But there have been lots of other examples. This is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a partial fake of a Belgian product, which did contain a reasonable amount of artesunate, but looking at Nick White's modeling of the consequences of reduced content of active ingredient in a medicine and its likely consequences in terms of pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic relationships, it would very likely to engender a drug resistance. And the French police went to the address at the bottom in Paris, and it's just a residential street. There's nobody there who apparently knows anything about the manufacturer of artesunate, at least say they didn't know. So it appears to be a false address. But there's been recently enormous problems with the quality of artemisinin-based combination therapy in Africa. This is one of the examples, dihydroartemisinin piperacin, was an important ACT. The packaging was wrong. They mixed up the French and the English to make a franglais, and it contained no antimalarial, but it did contain sildenafil or Viagra, which may sound surprising, but it's probably because I understand that Viagra is a blue color, and so is duochrotexin. So maybe they use that because actually sildenafil is apparently very inexpensive to manufacture, and it has a very similar color to duochrotexin. So maybe they use this deliberately as a way of camouflaging their fake product. But on the other hand, sildenafil is obviously not normally used by sick people, and it has side effects for the cardiopulmonary vasculature. So one could well imagine, if there's any evidence for this, but one could imagine that sildenafil in a febrile sick patient could be very bad news. This is a fake artesunate from Cameroon, a fake of a Vietnamese product that very worryingly contained chloroquine, no artesunate. So I guess one could argue that the criminals were being kind by putting some form of antimalarial in it. I doubt that, but the consequences could be more problematic than at first sight, because you'll know there's evidence from Malawi that chloroquine susceptibility is coming back. And maybe in the future, could chloroquine come back as a combination therapy? But with this covert ingestion by patients of drugs like chloroquine that nobody else knows that they're taking, and that will expose parasites to a low level of chloroquine, reducing the chances that in some time in the distant future, chloroquine may be able to come back as a falciparum antimalarial. This was very disturbing. This is a fake Halfan syrup from the DRC that contained no antimalarial activity, was a good copy. They even had a fake spoon. It comes with a spoon for giving the children and a packet. We don't know whether it was a genuine diverted spoon or a fake spoon, but I found that very disturbing. I think it's very important not to forget that there are like two sides to this coin. There's the falsified medicines and there's the substandard medicines. And there have been lots of also problems of substandard antimalarials. And these are very likely to be much more important than falsified medicines that mostly don't contain antimalarial in engendering drug resistance. And one key report, I think, was in Emerging Infectious Disease in 2009 by Toby Leslie, where they investigated a very large epidemic of malaria on the Afghan-Pakistan border that at first they thought was due to sulfadoxine pyrimethamine resistance. But no, they showed molecular markers and in vitro assays that the parasites remain sensitive. But it was not, it was due to medicine quality. But what they first did, as one would normally do, is that they looked for how much sulfadoxine and pyrimethamine were in the tablets, and that was fine. There were normal amounts of it. But when they did dissolution assays, there was minimal release of the sulfadoxine pyrimethamine from the tablets, meaning that in the human gastrointestinal tract, the tablets would not dissolve. So even though the tablets looked good on first-line screening, when you did the crucial dissolution tests that are not often done, they found that it would have led to very low drug concentrations within the blood. And the dissolution testing is very expensive, labor-intensive, and difficult. But I think the medicine quality community, for those reasons, is not doing enough about dissolution. And this is a well-known problem with SP or Fansidar. And there were reports from Tanzania of people taking SP tablets and them going in as white tablets and coming out the other end as white tablets as well, because they were so rock hard, they did not dissolve. The most worrying thing has been the fake Coartem. Coartem is, I think, used by 27 countries in Africa as their national and complicated malaria national treatment policy. And this was seized at the docks in Luanda in Angola in June 2012, along with 1.4 million others. 1.4 million, this is one course. And they were hidden in loudspeakers in a large container. And also there was a fake mebendazole, the anti-helminthic. This fake Coartem, it looks really good in comparison when you look at them side by side with a genuine. But the card, for some reason, they used a thinner card on the falsified medicine, and when you feel it, you can immediately tell that it's not right. And the other main difference is that the score marks on the tablets up here are different from on the genuine. But how many of us would remember the position of the score marks? And this is now, there have been WHO alerts about this, and it's now all the way Ghana, Togo, DRC, Angola, Cameroon. It's all over that very neglected part in terms of malaria control with many vulnerable people across Central and West Africa. And it has no antimalarial activity. And the yellow color is with paint, a dye. It's made of industrial dyes, which apparently are thought to be safe, but that still, it doesn't seem right that tablets contain paint. But I think another of the most worrying things about this was that this wasn't, a few people knew, but the first public news of this enormous seizure was on Facebook in 5 months later. And then the first press coverage was 11 months later in this article in the Wall Street Journal, which is a very good, thorough investigation of what was going on. But there was no a dissemination between the different countries of this information. And the head of malaria control at WHO found out from Facebook. Perhaps no more need to be said. But how many patients in West and Central Africa or anywhere outside of the industrialized world would routinely use Facebook and the Wall Street Journal to check that their medicine's all right? So I think it's very inappropriate, and we argue in a recent paper that the system is not functioning and things need to be done an awful lot better. The other thing about the mebendazole is that it contains no mebendazole, the Vermox. It does contain levamisole, which is a banned antihelminthic, which was banned in most of the industrialized world because it causes vasculitis and agranulocytosis. And there's been a recent epidemic of levamisole side effects because it's used to cut cocaine, to adulterate coke. And it causes, there has been epidemic in Britain and North America of bilateral ear necrosis. Apparently that's one of its adverse effects. So very worrying that there's medicines out there circulating that contain a toxic pharmaceutical. We reviewed all the reports on the WARN surveyor, all that information, which is just the publicly accessible information, to try and see, summarize the information. And you can see this is the frequency of publications per country. And there's an enormous number of countries either have no information or very few. So most of the information is from Nigeria, Tanzania, Ghana, Cambodia, Kenya, Laos, and Uganda. But you can see that very large numbers of very malarious countries with just one or two reports. And also, even more of concern, the number of samples collected in these surveys is actually extremely small. The red line is 10. So you can see that most of the surveys that have been conducted have used less than 10 samples. I mean, would one try and estimate the frequency of hypertension in Stockholm by measuring the pressure of 10 people? It's not good. But it's not just antimalarials. This was a tragic example from Bangladesh, investigated by a Dutch group. This miltefosone became national policy in Bangladesh for visceral leishmaniasis and had many advantages over the previous intravenous treatments. And this was used in the national program, but Bangladeshi doctors were worried because patients weren't getting better. And they, through investigation with the Dutch group, found that this national program medicine contained no miltefosone. So the national program was using a medicine with no active ingredient in it. Fake HIV drugs, Médecins Sans Frontières was recently stung, if you like, by a problem of fake HIV drugs in Kenya. There's been a whole host of other examples from fake rabies vaccine in China. 1,000 people were given fake flu vaccine at an oil plant in Texas. There's been ceftazidime in Vietnam, containing no ceftazidime, but containing streptomycin that you should not give intravenously. In India, there were HIV tests that were not HIV tests, HIV rapid diagnostic tests. They were actually repackaged, redone pregnancy tests. So the clinic realized something wrong when the only HIV positive patients were all pregnant women. There have been, in Tanzania, there have been bed nets labeled as insecticide-treated bed nets containing no insecticide. We've been recently working with Peru on fake morning after pills that contain no morning after pill ingredients. They contain, of all things, an antimalarial, pyrimethamine. Um, so, but what are the consequences of these examples? I think very clearly they must impact on patient outcome, though there are no good estimates as to its public health impact. But logically, if you have a potentially lethal disease that you know that, say, giving an ACT has a cure of 90-something%, and you don't give that, that antimalarial, the mortality will be the same as untreated malaria. And the same for the other examples that we've been discussing. But it also has many other ramifications. When people know of this, it makes people lose faith in health systems. It has a big impact on both the generic and the innovative pharmaceutical industries, has a big impact on health systems and wastage of money and people shopping around when one treatment doesn't go work to another health facility, and also drug resistance. In theory, falsified medicines that contain no active ingredient should not engender drug resistance. There's nothing for the parasites to see. But I think for some diseases that's wrong, and it could be very important. Would mostly think of the most important drugs, those that contain within the so-called window of selection, drugs that, for example, contain 50% active ingredient that would expose the parasites to subtherapeutic amounts of the active ingredient for the resistant parasites, but would kill the sensitive parasites or bacteria or viruses, leading to the resistant viruses, bacteria, or parasites becoming more frequently than the sensitive ones, and then onward transmission. I think malaria is perhaps a special case in that there are fake medicines, by causing treatment failure, will encourage very high human parasite densities in individual patients, higher gametocyte carriage. So you have some patients with an awful lot of parasites, and if then they take substandard medicines with reduced amount of active ingredient, in those patients, resistance would be selected for. And then with the very high gametocyte loads that are also a consequence of hyperparasitemia, then you'd expect further onward transmission. This has never been proven to be so, but I think it's an important theoretical consideration in the discussions on drug resistance. And so the worst situation for poor antimalarial quality leading to drug resistance might be community D here, which is a mixture of good, fake, and substandard medicines, which is probably what is in real life in much of malaria's world. So what should be done? I think there are an awful lot that needs to be done, and for some things we need to know a lot more. For other things we don't need more research. We know now what to do. I think among them is support for medicines regulatory authorities. Discuss a bit more about that later. There needs to be resolution of the definitions debate. Then I think we've failed in engaging civil society in this. There's been, like in South Africa and elsewhere, enormous civil society investment in trying to make sure that ARVs were accessible to patients with HIV. And that was groundbreaking and world-changing. But as a community, the medicine quality people, I think we've largely failed to engage civil society that this is a problem. And I'm not sure what we've done wrong. It'd be really interesting to know. And there needs to be much more effort to regulate the medicine supply and for international donors to check the quality of their supply. Until relatively recently, many of the big donors, the World Bank, the Global Fund, USAID, until recently they did not check any of their products, and that's changing now. There's very little data sharing and very few data available, which is, I think, very woeful at the moment. There's a reluctance in some parts of the pharmaceutical industry, not all, but not to release such information for commercial reasons. And there's been some very bad delays in the releasing of information, which I think it seems extraordinary that that's still allowed. And there needs to be independent public health risk assessments made by independent people, not by the pharmaceutical industry, to decide when to release information. I mean, with the recent problems with cars, I mean, should it be up to a car manufacturer to decide when to announce that the airbags in the car might kill you? I mean, should that just be their responsibility? I would suggest not. And therefore, for the same reason, I think that for medicines, we should be doing it the same way. We also don't really know what people know about medicine quality. There have been very few studies of this, one from Laos with Dr. Lamporn and one from Nigeria. But we still don't really know what pharmacists, the lay public, other health workers know about medicine quality. Therefore, how can we design interventions to engage with the public? There was a classic example maybe 10 years ago when WHO designed a big poster of a cobra within its coils lots of fake medicines. It was like a warning poster to say, don't take fake medicines. That to people in Europe, that looked very worrying and gave the right message. But in a country like Laos, it gave exactly the opposite message, because the cobra was having maternal care over these precious medicines in its coils. So we need much more investigation as to how to engage in different communities. In Lao, there's a term NATO, which has a different meaning, obviously, to how we normally think of it as a NATO, but no action, talk only. And Lao colleagues often talk about this as a NATO subject. And also, like with the example of Angola and the illegal importation of fake coartem, there was no way for Angola to engage with where they came from, because there's no international convention or treaty making the trade in falsified or poor quality medicines an international crime. Unlike I think it was in 1929, it became illegal to counterfeit banknotes. So now if I was to make falsified krona in Laos, the Swedish government could write to Laos and say, we would like this person to be brought to Sweden and face trial. And Laos would have it would have to do that. It couldn't do anything else. But there's nothing like that for medicines. So the people who made the fake coartem in Guangzhou in China, Angola had no way of saying, please, we would like to prosecute them. And again, the data sharing has been very poor until recently. And surely there should be a legal duty for us all, and for pharmacists and for the pharmaceutical industry, to report any suspect medicines to the national malaria, the National Medicines Regulatory Agency. And I think that's illustrated by this plane. I think it was 15 years ago, was flying, I think, to Norway from Denmark, and it crashed in the sea between Sweden and Denmark. I don't know whether you have heard of this. But this plane crashed because it had a fake bolt in its tail, and the tail came off in mid-flight. I think 56 people died, and that was the tail and the retrieved from the seabed. So in response to this, now I think in most countries in the world, it's a legal duty for anybody in the airline industry or connected with it, if they find a suspect part, they have to tell the National Civil Aviation Authority. We have that for planes. Why not for medicines? There's an obvious answer to that. I think one of the good things that's happened recently has been the revitalization of the WHO reporting system, which now releases alerts about medicine quality problems, some in the public domain, but many more amongst different medicine regulatory authorities. So they've enabled countries to become more linked up. Another problem is that the sampling of medicines has been done in a very prehistoric methodology. In that, as talked about earlier, you wouldn't estimate the prevalence of hypertension in Stockholm by asking 10 people to measure their blood pressure, which is what people have been doing, including our own group. But also, there was been very few where there's been any random selection. So it's like estimating the prevalence of hypertension in Stockholm by just choosing to measure the blood pressure of everybody in this room, which would clearly not be, if you tried to submit that to a scientific paper, it would be rejected immediately. But that's how medicine quality work has been done. And we're trying to encourage many more random surveys for those who would like to have a prevalence estimate with a confidence interval. There have only been 6 done of these so far. One of the problems is that it's incredibly hard to get funding for this type of work. But one potential solution to that is to use lot quality assurance sampling that was designed, I think, in the 1920s to see, like, if you were making cans of baked beans on a production line, how many cans of baked beans should you take off the conveyor belt to know that more than 90% of the cans of baked beans were good quality. So it gives a threshold. It can't tell you that the prevalence of poor quality cans of baked beans is 95%. It can or 5%. It can just let you know that it's above 90%. But the great advantage of it is that it's much simpler to do, much less expensive, with a lower sample size. And the first study using this came out last year from a group working on the quality of antibiotics in Saudi Arabia. You still, though, need to know, you still have to have lists of all the outlets so you can make a random selection of them. So I think that's one way forward where we could get more information. So you could do a screening. If you were worried about the quality of ampicillin in region X, you could do a lot quality assurance and set a threshold. And if obviously the threshold in reality should be 0%, but the world isn't like that. So if you set a threshold, and if it's better than that, then perhaps you can relax for the moment. If it's worse, then maybe one needs to do a formal random survey. Another, I think, important part of random surveys is that, one, they give you confidence intervals, but secondly, they allow you to objectively follow change through time. So you can look at the impact of interventions that it's really hard to do with the asking 10 people a non-random way of doing things, which you can't really compare. It's chalk and cheese. But I think one of the key things that the world isn't addressing is that, which we don't really need more research anymore, is to support medicines regulatory authority. Would suggest, although it's actually hard to produce evidence to prove this, that the reason that we have good quality in Europe and North America, Japan and Australasia is because of vibrant, active medicine regulatory authorities who, behind the scenes, are very important in policing the drug supply and regulating it. The WHO estimate that about 1/3 of global medicine regulatory authorities don't exist, or they have a capacity that hardly functions. and in sub-Saharan Africa, 63% had minimal capacities. And also in malarious Africa, there are only 3 countries, one in South Africa, one in Tanzania, and one in Kenya, who have a WHO pre-qualified medicine and analysis lab, which I think again is of great concern, because medicine analysis in Africa should be done in Africa. It shouldn't be done, as has been so often in the past, in Europe and North America. So there needs to be a lot more international political will and financial will to try and work out with medicine regulatory authorities globally how their capacity be increased. These figures from WHO come from a situation analysis that they did, but it's a confidential one. They can't say which countries are in which category. But maybe if such a situational analysis could be linked to an overt plan to try and obtain funding to support medicine regulatory authority, maybe countries would be willing for that information to be shared if it was formally linked to a fundraising, human capacity linked scheme. I think it's not all bad news, in that there are these new devices that have come on the market in the last 10 years that are portable, battery-powered devices that you can use all day and then recharge overnight. They're about 3 or 4 times the size of this you hold in your hand. They're based on Raman or near-infrared technology mostly. And there's a hope that these maybe could be used to empower drug inspectors. They're expensive, but they need no consumables. And they're currently being used a lot in Nigeria and in China and now in Cambodia. However, the bad news is that there have never been any independent field comparisons of their diagnostic accuracy, their ease of use, or their cost effectiveness. And certainly for the Raman, there are problems because they're ironically not very good for the artemisinin-based combination therapy. And a good and a bad thing about them is they're brand specific, because the Raman interrogates the signature of the whole tablet, including the excipients and everything in it. If you were to say to take the signature of Novartis Coartem and Cipla Coartem, the genuine versions, they would the signatures would be very different. So you need, in the machine, it has a chip with a library, and you need to have each brand in there. We've been recently evaluating a different device in Laos, which is this new CD3 machine, which was invented by the US FDA. That's a packaging analysis device that you look at the package using a variety of different wavelengths of light, and you can quite quickly see differences between the stored genuine packet and your suspect packet if it is indeed falsified. But it's only really good for falsified medicines. It won't be very good for substandard medicines. But it is relatively easy to use, and it's also relatively inexpensive. So if any of you will be at the New Orleans American Society meeting in November, every year we have a WARN medicine quality side meeting at this. So if you're going to be at that meeting and would like to attend, I'll send an email around about it in a few weeks, but do let me know if you'll be there and would like to go. It's open to anybody who's interested. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much. This was really interesting, and a long time back I was involved with Lamporn in Laos.
Yes, oh sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, so but that was probably too long back. But please, do you have some questions, comments on this?
Okay, thank you, Paul, for a very interesting presentation. I've been working a long time in Vietnam, and now recently done a study on nosocomial infections, and we have a large problem with gram-negative bacteria that's resistant to carbapenems, and collagen use is increasing, and so on. And also, if you look at the Vietnamese, then I guess the same is in Laos, China, about 60% of the costs in the hospital are for medicines. It's a huge market, right? And I've been reading a bit about counterfeit and or falsified and substandard drug. In Vietnam, they do this kind of sampling, and they said about 0.5% of the medicines are counterfeit.
Mm-hmm.
Substandard is much harder. So, but the question is now, one, do you have any idea about the proportions of drugs that are falsified and substandard? As I understand, the surveys are not good, but can you do an estimation about that? What is the global market for this? And as it seems a lot is actually made in China, right? And what are the Chinese authorities do? And China is still a very regulated country, so I guess this must be some link even to the government or to drug pharmaceutical companies in China. Is that in any way discussed, and in such a way how?
I'll try and repeat your questions. Please tell me if I get them wrong. So number one was that, are there any good estimates of the prevalence of falsified and substandard medicines globally? And the second was, what is the Chinese government doing about the problems of medicine quality? For the first question, there are no good global estimates that are evidence-based. In about 2002, WHO issued a statement that they thought that there were 200,000 extra deaths from poor quality antimalarials globally, but they quickly removed that because it was very much a back of the envelope guesstimate. It wasn't really based on any evidence, and I think there are no good estimates. There's a paper that has been submitted that uses for the first time modeling to use the evidence in the AQ surveyor for antimalarials to give the first estimate of the number of under 5 deaths, excess under 5 deaths from malaria. But apart from that, it's and those 6 random surveys, there's very little evidence. And I think one thing that's really become clear is that there are hotspots of problems. Like, it seems that Rwanda has remarkably good medicine quality from all the recent evidence that has come out. But there are large areas of Africa with no information. In Laos, we had an awful problem, but that's got better. So there's a lot of change through time and space. And I think if you see any estimates of the prevalence of poor quality medicines globally, would take them with an enormous pinch of salt, apart from a few focal studies. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
And then for China, from my understanding, I've had no direct contact, but my understanding is that China is trying to do what it can about this problem, but it's had an enormous problem with a pharmaceutical manufacturing industry that just rocketed, and investment in medicine regulation has not kept up with that. And there's a Chinese social scientist in the UK actually working on this, trying to look at the Chinese government responses to the medicine quality problem and try and understand the history and the future of that. But it clearly needs a lot more to be done, but a lot more done globally. 4 years ago, a British man was sentenced to 8 years in jail in London for trading in enormous amounts of fake medicines, including some that were destined for a clinical trial, interestingly. And in Paris, 2 years ago, a Frenchman was caught making antimalarials in his kitchen for DRC, and they were made of laxatives, and he went to jail. So it's a global problem, and there's been lots of emphasis on China, which I think is right, but it's a problem everywhere. the space and the equipment that you need to make 1 million fake medicines, you could put in the corner of this room with minimal investment. So it's an easy thing to do. Is that answered?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And trade, yeah. Trade routes, can you, if you say track the drugs,
Mhm.
how do they get into the market?
So the question was, how do drugs get in the market? I don't think we really. Some people know something about it, and they're largely the pharmaceutical investigators for the pharmaceutical industry. There's an enormous number of people, if you like, private detectives or industrial detectives who work on this, and they know quite a lot about this, but that's not in the public domain. But I think a fascinating thing is that when ACT Watch, this large project in 5 African countries and 1 Asian country, tried to map the distribution chains of antimalarials. The distribution chains were incredibly diverse. There was no, I'd always thought distribution chains were like this, but it was very wrong. They're sort of like this. And the pattern in each country was very different. So it's very country dependent. And clearly there are some medicines put in at a very high level, that they get into the supply chain high up, and others low down. Like in Southeast Asia, the fake artesunate that came from China into Burma was bought on mules, on donkeys, bypassing the customs posts, to low-level pharmacies. On the other hand, there were others coming in that went to the high up in the supply chain. But the short answer is that in the public domain, we don't really know.
Thank you very much. We have many questions here now. 2 questions from the computer or the people in the other countries and 2 here. But first of all, I would like to ask Su Gubin, who is actually from Guangzhou in China, to comment if there was any news in the newspapers about this, or if you have any other comments about the situation. Very short.
It's astonishing for me to hear that there was so much fake medicines in that products from China. But I think there are several multi-levels can be done to issue this problem. The first, why so many fake medicines from China? I think there's one thing that the pharmaceutical company should do, that they should guarantee that the quality of the medicine from the true company, not to fight against the fake company.
Sure.
That's one thing that pharmaceutical company can do. And the second is the government level, that the government should have some rules or some criteria that distinguish that that this rule is very easily to be performed to distinguish the fake medicine and the real medicine.
Yes.
And the third level, I think, is the receiver or the countries that needs this kind of medicine. They should have some standards to check whether this medicine is true or fake before they try to buy this kind of medicine. Those stuff, I think there's 3 levels can be done to this issue. But I think China is just one of these companies that can produce medicine. In fact, this kind of medicine is originates from the herbal medicine in China,
Sure.
where it is
Sure.
originates in Han dynasties or even longer before. That means that there were some kinds of infectious disease can be cured through or via the herbal medicine in China. That is
Sure.
the other things that we can discover in
Yes.
traditional Chinese medicine.
Yes.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with all your 3 points. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess how to do that, that's the
difficulty.
difficulty. I
Yes.
absolutely agree. Yeah.
I think if we could take one
question from, you can show where to, and you can read the question to everyone, maybe.
Right. So there's a question from Atia. I want to understand more on lot quality assurance sampling. Who can do it? Is it routinely done by any particular group or agency? Thank you for the question. There are various reviews of lot quality assurance sampling, and if you send me an email, I can send you some papers about it. We wrote a paper in 2009 in PLOS Medicine where we suggested its use, and on the WHO website at the moment they have a draft update of that for WHO as a report on drug medicine quality sampling that's WHO have put on asking for comments. So that would be some sources for information on that. But there's only one scientific research group has used it for medicine quality. That was the group from Saudi Arabia. Does that answer your question?
So then we can take a question from the audience here in Stockholm.
Thank you very much for an excellent and eye-opener in terms of this problem. What is the pharmaceutical industry itself doing about it? Because I think there are a lot of stakes involved, not only financial but reputation of the industry. So what are they doing about it?
Yes. So the question was, what are the pharmaceutical industry doing about this problem? There's a great diversity of actions, I think most of which we don't really hear much about, but all the wealthy pharmaceutical industry companies have their own investigation department. The main companies in Europe would have maybe 5 staff based in headquarters responsible for liaising about this and with staff in the field. I think the problem is that for companies with less funds to spare on this, it makes it much harder. And that was a major problem for Guilin 10, 15 years ago. They just didn't have the resources to help with this. And I went to see them a few times, and they were very interested by the work that our group had been doing, because in the end it helped them. And there are some companies like Cipla in India, which have a relatively higher funding. They're able to do this, but with the burgeoning generics industry, they have fewer funds that they can use to invest in this. But also, in a way, should it really be in part their job? Perhaps it should be a linkage between themselves and the National Medicine Regulatory Authority, as it would be in Europe.
It's from China. Yeah, this one. Yeah.
You can, yes.
Yeah.
So the question is, argue that the punishment system is the most curtail fake drugs like other fake projects only make the producers who make these drugs burden huge punishment can solve the problems rudely. Yes, I agree. I guess the issue is that there's enormous diversity in the punishments available, and most countries have very low penalties, and extraordinarily, the penalties for, if you like, public health impact of falsification are often a lot lower than the penalties for intellectual property counterfeit crimes. And that's one of in a way, the drug industry is a bind. So that's one of the reasons why they push the IP agenda. One of them, not the only one, in that it gets a higher penalty for those who are caught. But the number of prosecutions relative to the number of offences is very low.
My name is Rolf Noster. Thank you very much for presentation. I think it's more than 10 years since you published the first article on this in the Memoir.
Yeah, yes.
And as you mentioned, it wasn't the most powerful study then.
Sure, yeah.
Quite small sample and so on, but
Yeah.
it was the first, really born signals of this problem. And so many years have passed, and we're still fighting. And it's remarkable. I really admire this. But more should have happened, of course. That's really obvious. We have talked about possible reasons for why it hasn't happened and what can be done. This was just a comment. My question was about the communities, 4 types of communities. And one was where there were good drugs and false drugs. And you said that there is no resistance there. I understood so. Not much. But if you have false drugs and there is no effect, then you start using second line drugs.
Sure, yeah.
And then that could enhance the number of resistant to second line.
Sure.
So it's a great problem from that perspective also. Maybe you mentioned it. But
Yes, that's you're summarizing in a way the argument I was trying to express about the circle D on the bottom right. That the combination of falsified medicines that lead to high levels of untreated disease with high bacterial, parasites, and
also that
viral.
they can start treating with second line drug.
Yeah,
before
sure.
this magnification of gameticides and so on happens.
Yes.
But still, then the problem of resistance to second line drugs may increase. So
Yeah, sure.
it's a problem, however you turn your position. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Agreed. Yeah.
We have a lot of questions here now. First, we take the one from Dina that comes here. And then we have Anders, then we have Jon Vishal, then we have Jonathan.
Right.
And then I think there was one, maybe not, yeah. First, Dina.
Yes, so Dina wrote to say what would be the best strategy to empower or increase capacity of MRAs. Others suggested regional MRA collaborations and uppooling of resources. In addition, I think quality use of medicine is not high on the agenda, as focus on access, but little attention to the quality and even who sells them. Absolutely agree, Dina. I think regional collaborations are important. I understand that the East African community is discussing that for those countries, and I gather that the African Union has a project for the harmonization of medicine regulatory authority work across the African Union countries. So I think it's going to be enormously hard for the world to have the 30% of countries that don't have MRA function, and to have a regional based approach is the only likely way that this could go forward, because there won't be enough money or people. There aren't enough trained people in the world probably to staff those sort of missing medicine regulatory authorities. So no, absolutely agree.
Then Anders.
Paul, yes. We discussed a little bit legal action is important, and obviously it's difficult to have it deployed optimally. And we discussed legal action against producers. How is it with selling drugs? Is that can you always say that you were in good faith, or is it illegal to sell fake drugs?
It's so the question was legal action against producers is all well and good, but what about those who are selling them lower down the distribution chain?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's afflicted by the same problem as trying to prosecute producers, in that many countries don't have laws for either group. The definitions are often very vague and confusing. The penalties are low, and it's not high enough on the agenda. Very few people that I'm aware of actually selling rather than producing poor quality medicines have been prosecuted. But also another key thing is that there's very little information, at least in the public domain, as to what pharmacists know. So, I mean, pharmacists ideally should know and have confidence in their drug supply, but clearly in many parts of the world, they don't. So I think it needs to be a combination of carrot and stick, with the carrot that pharmacists need more training in how to recognize poor quality medicines and being inquisitive and being careful. And the stick is that if they're trained and they don't take the right measures, then sure, to prosecute. It's a new field that nobody's really explored, and the very despairingly, the legal and enforcement community tend not to be interested in either doing anything about it or in having this discussion about what's the right way of preventing this problem or doing something about it. There are very few.
How even in UK and Sweden is it illegal to sell fake drugs?
Yes, it is. It is in Sweden and UK. Yeah.
But it must also be recognized that in many countries it's actually not pharmacists at all involved in selling drugs. There are a lot of uneducated people selling drugs also. Now we have Vishal have a question here somewhere, and then we have Jonathan, we have Sandhya, and
They sent us 2 questions actually.
there are more questions even.
This one
and
the last one.
Okay. So Vishal wrote to say, I wish to know how to identify the fraudulent substandard drug at community level. I think that's a key question, but I'm afraid I have to answer that I don't know. I'm not sure anybody knows. I've spent ages looking at fake and genuine packets, and that fake coatum I showed, first time I saw it, I got it wrong. I thought it was genuine, despite having a genuine comparator. So I don't know how the lay public will be able to determine this. I think to ask your pharmacist, the outlet seller, where these came from, are they sure they're okay, to have like civil society pressure from the grassroots going up to say, where did this come from? Yes, so to grassroots pressure to say, where did this come from and are you sure it's okay? And the person who went to jail in the UK, his name was Peter Gillespie, he was found out originally by a patient in London with a psychiatric disease who went to the pharmacist and said that my antipsychotic medication has changed, it's different, I don't trust it. And the pharmacist called the British MRA, and that's what led to him getting an 8-year jail sentence. That was the nodal event. So it does show that the patients and the lay public can have an impact.
Thank you. Now we had Jonathan.
Yes, thank you for the great presentation. I'm pretty new to this field, and this question is perhaps a bit basic, but I was wondering about the economic incentives for creating these falsified drugs and how much money is earned compared to just making ordinary drugs. As you said, some of the substances or the drugs contained partly the substances they normally have in some limit. And if this can be compared to production of other drugs, for example, narcotics. And
yes, so the question, what are the financial incentives for making poor quality medicines versus genuine medicines? Would that be a fair summary? So again, we don't really know. You'll see estimates on the web. I think there was one estimated that it was worth 80 billion, it was dollars or euros, but an awful lot of money. But that, as I can see it, that's just a back of the envelope, not really based on any evidence. It's really hard to know how anybody can estimate it because we don't really know how common they are anyway. So how can you model the financial aspects without knowing that? But it's clearly if you wanted to make fake medicines here in that corner, all you need a few people, some drums of powder, a laser printer, a tableting machine. You can buy a tableting machine is about twice the size of that cabinet, and in a day you can make tens of thousands. So it's low cost, high gain, low risk. But I don't think wouldn't trust any numbers that you see, because I can't quite see how they can be derived.
Then we had Sandhya.
Thank you very much for giving this important presentation. I'm from India. I just want to say, because nowadays the technology has improved and it is connectivity and all the social networking sites, and we used to get a lot of messages or information through this type of things. This is the drug which is original, which is the fake, or if you take this one, this is the consequences, or all the repercussions, all these things, messages we generally used to get. But I just want to know whether is there any authentic body organization which is exclusively working to follow, because sometimes this type of messages are useful. You can follow some of the beneficial things are there. But whether for this type of pharmaceutical things and drugs and all, is there any authentic body which is working to pass the message which is very, very much useful for the public sake? And I just want to.
Sure. Thank you. So I think to summarize the question, it was: is there a global body that tries to disseminate this information and alert people? Is that right? There are some national bodies and some national regulatory authorities have been very good at issuing alerts, like the Kenyan Medicine and Poisons Board. So that's not the proper name in Kenya, but the Kenyan MRA. They've been very good at issuing lots of alerts, and in Nigeria, but most countries don't. And there's not been a global body that's taken this up. We hope that WHO and the new rapid alert system might allow that, but it hasn't happened yet. So I fear the answer, from what I can see, is not yet. And there aren't, but that it's not. There's not been much discussion about moving in that direction either.
Yaron.
Yes, I had a comment about this recognizing drugs at community level. I know they've been, I don't know if they're actually put into more larger context or if it's just trials, but where they've marked certain packages of drugs with a code that people can send in a text message and get feedback to say whether this is fake or not.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Sure. So the question was, I guess, about empowering patients to check the quality of their medicines through text messaging codes. Would that be right?
Yes.
So yes, there are systems developed largely in Ghana and India where you, on your packet, you have a long code, the same as if you buy a top-up, a pay-as-you-go phone card. And that's a unique number that's apparently very hard to falsify. And so you type that into your phone and text. And where it has been used, as I understand it, especially in Ghana, it's been very effective. But you need a good mobile phone coverage and you need public awareness. The texts, as I understand it, are free. And there are two main companies, M-Pedigree and Sproxel, who are doing this. But it will still not address the most vulnerable people who don't have a mobile phone. You have to. Another problem is that so many of the medicines that are sold globally are not in a language that the people who take them can read. In Lao, the packaging is largely unreadable. It's in English, French, Arabic, German, and there's not in Lao. So again, patients aren't going to know how to do that. So, but in principle, I think it's a great idea, but for some communities, but it can't be a global thing yet until we have implanted mobile phones in our heads or something.
Could we just ask Ashish, for example, have you any experience this from India?
Yeah, not really the kind of experience we are talking about of counterfeit and things like that, but we have had problems with drug resistance for a long time. We have problems with anti-malarial resistance, and we have looked at molecular markers as well for SP resistance. And I was actually thinking about that when I saw your presentation of dissolution assays in our setup. Is it a problem related to that we have found a lot of resistance with SP?
Yes.
And how to look about it?
Yes.
I'm not sure about that. Your comment on that, and also how much of our antibiotic resistance is really being contributed by I would say substandard drug, not too much counter fake there, because we have a huge pharmaceutical industry. There is no so substandard drugs are a major problem in India rather than counterfeit at present.
Yes.
So your comment on that?
Absolutely agree, and I think the contribution of poor medicine quality to drug resistance is something that hasn't been addressed but urgently needs to be addressed. How we do that is a very difficult question. But I looked at 4 recent large reviews of TB drug resistance in high impact journals, and none of the 4 had any discussion as to whether the growing MDR and XDR was in any way related to the quality of TB drugs. And the use of drugs in monotherapy. We recently found in Laos isoniazid and rifampicin for sale over the counter as monotherapy.
Yes, thank you. Then we have, can't pronounce your name, but you, yes.
Please pronounce your name. Okay. Great, and I think your presentation is really good. And I also think about the case that use mobile scan, what's the message to the customer. I think now the mobile, especially for the smartest mobile phone, the price is down.
Sure.
And they can make it. And I also think another, maybe we could just send them text message language because they're different. Can we send some picture, or anybody can understand it, or the video or any another information?
So the question was, could we use pictures of the packaging in addition to the text mechanism? Yeah. I think one could, but I think that the text, the code is it's like 10, 15 digits. It takes a while to type in, but it responds yes or no. Whereas a picture of a packet, as we've seen in those 2 artesunate packets, a picture of that, unless you know that dot should or shouldn't be there, it's really, really difficult. So I think that the text code gives some security to knowing that the answer you get back is the right one.
I think the right one, maybe the company, which company is really medicine company, or some maybe make the box and you can check the government who admire this company is real, another is not true.
Yes. One of the things that's been discussed is that could people falsify the checking system? So all you need is a phone and with a computer that can respond to text messages. So that's one of the reasons why there's been a move to keep it just one number in one organization per country. So just one number. So there can't be any other numbers to try and make sure that nobody who's very clever at IT does that.
Then Dusan.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is regarding research methodology. How would you envision quantification of the issue on a global scale? Can we utilize the infrastructure that is already existing, for instance, pharmacovigilance tools, to quantify it on a global scale?
Yes. So the question, if I could summarize, was that could pharmacovigilance tools be used to help to quantify the problem? Yes, I think they could. It would still, pharmacovigilance often, as my understanding, would give you alerts of problems, but doesn't often say, okay, in this country, X% of patients who take this medicine per year get an adverse event. That's not, normal pharmacology is looking for problems to investigate further. So I think that would be one issue with it. And if one would like point estimates with confidence intervals to look through change through time, I think one has no other choice but to use either lot quality assurance or some form of stratified random study. It's an awful lot of work. For example, we did a study recently in Laos where we collected 1,000 samples in a stratified random study, and it took 2 people 3 months just to sort the samples and to scan them. So it's just enormous amount of work.
My question is regarding the collaboration between the scientific group and pharmacy company. While we know there is some specific guidelines regarding antibiotic resistance, like UCAS, European Committee Antibiotic Resistance, Antibiotic Susceptibility Testing, and they offer, of course, for example, minimum inhibitory MIC and clinical breakpoint to treatment infection. But why there is no yet the good collaboration between them to produce the development drug? If I want to summarize my question, there is the international guidelines for pharmacy company to produce new drug.
So the question, I think, was, are there international guidelines for production of new drugs?
Yeah.
So that's rather outside my field. I'm not aware of any, but for new drugs, maybe somebody else might know better than I am. Sorry, I'm not.
Could maybe find out through the course, but right now I'm also not really aware. There is one final question here. In India.
Right. So Vishal has asked, in India, the government promotes generic medicines at primary health center level. So my question is, how a common man can identify the generic medicine? I think it, maybe going slightly outside that question, I think it's important to note that generic medicines that are authorized by a regulatory authority are very good until proven otherwise. And there's no, I happily take generic, I take 3 medicines a day and they're all generic and they're not innovator, and because they're less expensive. And there's been problems in the past with the conflation of generic with counterfeit, not with falsified, but with counterfeit. And that's been one of the drivers to move away from the use of the term counterfeit. There was about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a big problem where the Dutch customs intercepted some generics that were good generics, which generics are good, just to make the point, on suspicion of them being counterfeited. There was no evidence that they were counterfeited. They were going, I think, to Brazil from India. And that caused enormous discussion and controversy and debate. So I think the concepts of whether medicines are innovative or generic should be entirely divorced from their quality. And if you were to mean how to identify poor quality medicines at primary health centre level, I think it's very difficult, as discussed earlier. I think one thing I forgot to mention is that there's some evidence that falsified medicines are often less expensive than their genuine counterparts. That was certainly the case for the fake artesunate. It was about half the cost. But more recent work has said that maybe the falsification people are getting more greedy, and recently the costs are very similar. But certainly if you see a medicine that was less expensive than you think it should be or it has been, then that should ring a large alarm bell in head.
Now we have a final thing here, and then you come back to your packages.
Okay.
Yes, actually, I met a colleague of mine from one of the EPIC centers which monitors drug quality in India.
All right.
And very recently they got an ampule which did not mention what it contained, but was costing somewhere close to 1,000 US dollars in India. In Indian rupees, that is a very large amount. And apparently that was sent to them by a patient whose relative was treated in a very sort of corporate hospital for sepsis. And when they ran they have chromatography and other high-end instrument, they found it was sterile water.
Yes.
So, and there was no address there was an address mentioned, but the address was not traceable like what you mentioned.
Yes.
So that was promoted by one of the representatives to treat sepsis, and that contained absolutely nothing but water.
So $1,000 of water.
Yeah. 2 ml.
Rolf, did you have some?
Yeah, it's a comment about what you can do at the sales point. And I know that things have been done, for example in Laos, to assure that the drugs that are sold are good. But that was on a quite simple level. They had a rule that they had the pharmacist or drug owner had to show the bill of the company, so that they could show where it was bought from.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't correct, if they couldn't show the bill, they got some kind of fine. In Laos, this was not very high. But the strongest punishment for a drug seller is to withdraw their license.
Yeah.
And no drug seller wants that. So couldn't more be done actually there? And of course you would restrict probably to some extent the opportunity for the drug sellers to buy drugs, but you could have this, and these are the approved manufacturers you can buy from. If you buy from anyone else, you will be punished.
Yes.
Has it been done in some countries, or
because
these drugs, falsified drugs, are not sold by the genuine manufacturers.
No, the question is, where do they enter the system of drug distribution?
Where are they?
Yeah.
So the question was, where do
they enter the normal system of drug distribution, or do they ever enter that normal system, or are they sold in totally separate lines?
I think it's a mixture of all of the above, from what I hear. It's likely that countries will differ in that regard, just as the genuine distribution patterns vary between countries, that there are parallel falsified medicine distribution patterns that will also differ.
Yeah, but there is some kind of transaction made at
yes,
some point,
sure.
and it's that transaction that should be sort of investigated, and if it's not.
No, I agree. It will need more medicine regulatory authority capacity, but it needs carrot and stick approach by the MRA to do this. But quite how, I don't know.
I think there is scope for, even if you didn't think there was scope for more research, I think maybe there is scope for some research in this area to find out the distribution ways and so. I think time is now approaching 11, but we had this very interesting thing circulating in the room. So if you could come back to these different packages that you circulated and can see.
Could I ask, did anybody make their choice? So you
did. Like toes in the coin.
Sorry?
It was like toes in the coin because I couldn't really tell.
Yes. Oh, it's so who would like to survive and who would like to go to intensive care at Karolinska Hospital? Would anybody like to say whether they picked CAM 1001.
I picked that one.
1001. You picked that one? Yep. So this one, you picked that one. Just two people. Okay. So that's. I'm afraid you need lumbar puncture, central line, hemodialysis, and intensive care. We very much hope that with intravenous artesunate you'll survive. No, afraid that's a fake from Ghana, but it's a good fake. You did well. You could have chosen a worse one, but this contains a small amount of pyrimethamine, which probably won't help you there. Did anybody choose? What's this one? Which one did I just say?
That one.
Oh yes. So Ghana 0901. Who did anybody? You choose Ghana 0901. Yeah. Anybody else? Surely some more people would have liked that one. No? Only one. I'm afraid it's intensive care. There's an error on this that it's hard to see, and I didn't know about it, but one needs to read German to. They misspell the word for store in German, which I gather is lagern, and they didn't look at the genuine part, and they, instead of writing RN, they wrote M. So that's the crucial clue that you need to know German in Ghana, this is from Ghana, and how many people in Ghana can read German with a font of about size 8. So bear in mind that these all might be fake. The fact that I've chose this one might not mean anything. What about Ken 0601? You'd like Ken 06? Anybody else?
What's that one?
Did anybody, so the rest of you would prefer not to take any medicine? No? Sorry?
After this talk, yes.
I'm afraid I'm delighted to say that you got the right one.
Yay!
But I think for me the right answer is to take all of them. But no, that's genuine. It has the German spelling is correct on that one. So here's so this contains pyrimethamine.
And I'm happy to say that I selected the correct one, not because of the German, but as a pharmacist feeling. And that is what you do often as a pharmacist. You have some sort of...
That's not so reliable.
No, it's not reliable, but it often works. I have the experience.
What was wrong with the other counterfeit?
Trying to remember now. It's impossible to know without seeing a genuine, but the bars in the red circles are wrong. And there's also a difference where it has like 30 degree, the superscript position, I've forgotten it's slightly too high or too low. When you have 30 degrees Celsius, the superscript is not at the right horizontal position, which again is obviously very easy to notice.
It's the first to look at.
Yes.
So thank you very, very much for this very enlightening talk. We are very happy that you came today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.